It would be diplomatic malpractice of the worst order not to examine every possibility of whether or not you can achieve that before you ask people to take military action.
That, of course, was Secretary of State John Kerry speaking this morning about the possibility of talks with Iran as part of the ongoing diplomatic thaw between Tehran and the West. Kerry's statements probably won't sit well with Israel, the most outspoken critic of the current situation. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has gone as far as to say that Israel is willing to stand alone against Iran when he spoke earlier this week at the UN. So is Israel being too skeptical, or is it actually the only sane actor in this whole equation? Joining me tonight is Jonathan Schanzer. He's the Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a friend of the show. He's also the author of the forthcoming book, State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State. Jonathan, thanks for joining.
My pleasure. Thanks.
So let's start with this notion of diplomatic malpractice, if you will. Do you think that the administration at least comes at this from the proposition, Jonathan, and it's hard for you to estimate this, I know, it's hard for anybody, because given what we've seen in recent weeks, I don't think anyone knows the extent to which they're able to make blunders. But do you think they at least know that Iran's behavior would have to change before we should start the unraveling of sanctions that, by the way, would be hard to re-ravel, if you will?
Well, that's right. I mean, once you begin to undo sanctions, you can't put them back in. You've got a bunch of European countries right now and other countries around the world, in Asia as well, that are just salivating at the opportunity to get back into Iran and to start doing business again. Of course, they were put to a choice between U.S. markets and Iran. And so right now, that is the big question. Is the United States at this point ready to give sanctions relief to Iran without getting something up front? And that's the question that we're all asking. I think certainly the White House needs to be thinking very carefully about engaging with Iran. If there is an opening, they should obviously try to pursue it so that we don't have a war in our hands in a couple of months' time. But then again, you also need to make sure that the right deal is cut, or the consequences could be devastating.
Right. I want to push you on that issue of a war on our hands, because Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's been very clear on just what he thinks is going on here. Let's play a clip from him.
The only difference between them is this. Ahmadinejad was a wolf in wolf's clothing. Rouhani is a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Very clear language from the Prime Minister of Israel there. Just not to necessarily tie these two things together, Jonathan, but there were also reports of an assassination last night of a cyber warfare commander in Iran, Mujtaba Ahmadi. He was killed, unless you believe that maybe he tripped and his handgun happened to shoot him twice in the heart at close range. It looks like he was assassinated. What do these two things, how do they coexist, if you will? The notion of smart diplomacy, the open hand to Rouhani, the new leader of Iran. Meanwhile, Iranian nuclear scientists, and in this case an Iranian cyber warfare commander, they seem to have pretty dangerous jobs.
Well, they do, and obviously we don't know exactly who is responsible for this. We don't know. I think the assumption is probably that the Israelis were involved on some level, and of course that's what's been implied throughout the media today. And the bottom line is this, is that Iran is the state sponsor of terror in the world. It is the most prolific of them. It is developing an illicit nuclear program. It is an extremely dangerous actor. And so, you know, there's every reason to continue to conduct a shadow war if you're the Israelis. There's every reason to conduct a shadow war if you're the United States.
Now, Jonathan, let me ask you there, because people seem to think, and look, this administration clearly thinks that diplomacy has at least the chance of succeeding. Maybe they're not just going through the motions, but really the problem with Iran is not Iran's pursuit of illicit nuclear capability. The problem with Iran is the Iranian regime. Once again, it seems like we come back to this issue. You correctly point out they're state sponsors of terrorism. They have the blood of U.S. troops on their hands in Iraq. They have the blood of countless thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands probably coming in Syria. This negotiating process can't be done in a vacuum. It has to be said that unless the Iranian regime changes, we'll be facing this at some point in the future, even if they set it back for a while, won't we?
That's right. And so what we don't want to have is a sort of a deal where you're just mowing the lawn. That's exactly right. And by the way, we also shouldn't be cutting a deal where we basically say, okay, as long as you give up your weapons of mass destruction, we're okay if you slaughter hundreds of thousands of people in Syria and you know, you sponsor militias that attack the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so this needs to be the sort of deal that defangs Iran across the board. Again, I think it's very unlikely that we're able to get to that deal, but certainly I don't think anyone is going to fault the White House for at least just trying to get there. The big question that we all have, and this is what we continue to raise questions about, is does this White House know what a good deal looks like, and will they make sure that they get what they need up front? In other words, we should not basically, start to give sanctions relief until we can verify that Iran has stood down on a number of fronts.
And meanwhile, there's always the possibility, Jonathan, that Israel may decide to go it alone, as they have done several times in the past, preventing nuclear proliferation in the Middle East and Syria and Iraq. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.